Coming home from the ocean is almost never cinematic. No applause. No one standing at the porch waiting. No perfect music rising in the background. Usually it's just exhaustion, salt dried into your clothes, and the strange silence that comes after months of engines, steel decks, and open water. That evening, I expected exactly that. I pulled into my driveway thinking I'd cut the engine, grabbed my duffel, unlocked the front door, and stepped back into a house that had been sitting still without me. Instead, before I even put the truck in park, Karen's front door slammed open across the yard. She didn't stop for shoes. She didn't stop for a jacket. She didn't stop to think. She ran barefoot across the wet grass like 6 months apart had only been 6 minutes. Like something had been trapped inside her chest for so long that the sight of my truck was enough to break it open. And the strangest part, I hadn't told anyone I was coming home early. So why was she already crying before I even opened the truck door? My name is Ray, and for 11 years the sea has been my job more than it has ever been my dream. I worked offshore supply, which sounds cleaner than it is. In reality, it meant hauling crew, equipment, food, spare parts, chemicals, and whatever else a deep water operation needed out into the Gulf and beyond. The work paid well. The hours didn't matter because there really weren't hours, only shifts. Time stopped behaving like it did on land. Days blurred into watches, maintenance, weather reports, coffee, and sleep that never felt deep enough. That contract had gone longer than usual. Most hitches were rough but manageable. This one stretched into 6 months because the company needed bodies on a deep water project near the Yucatan Shelf, and enough money was attached to the job to make saying no feel irresponsible. Karen had moved in next door about 2 years before that hitch started. She was in her mid-30s, worked as a physical therapist, and ran much of her business out of a converted garage office. At first, we were just neighbors in the ordinary sense. A wave over the fence, borrowed tools, casual porch conversations when the weather cooperated. Then, ordinary began to shift. My plants got watered before I asked. Her gutter got fixed before she mentioned it. A loaf of bread would appear on my counter on Sundays. I'd come back from the hardware store with the coffee she liked without making a thing of it. Nothing was ever named. That was the problem, because once two people start showing up for each other without talking about why, the silence starts carrying more weight than the words ever would. By the time that 6-month hitch began, Karen was already holding back something neither of us was brave enough to say out loud. The day before I left, she came over to help me pack. My bedroom looked like every pre-departure bedroom I'd ever had duffel on the bed. Stacks of shirts, chargers, paperwork, work boots by the door, that half-organized mess that happens when a man tries to prepare himself for months away by folding everything twice. Karen had a habit of refolding things I had already folded badly. She stood at the foot of the bed smoothing out a shirt I'd packed 10 minutes earlier, and the room felt too quiet for two people who knew each other as well as we did. "You'll email when you can?" she asked. The words were simple. Her tone wasn't. "When there's signal," I said. "Depends where they send us. Could be spotty." Evening light spilled through the blinds in thin orange bars. She nodded, but her hands slowed. "I hate how far you go," she said. That was new. Not shocking exactly. Just honest in a way we hadn't allowed before. I tried to lighten it. Distance pays better. Not everything is about the paycheck, Ray. There are moments that only reveal themselves later as turning points. At the time, I let that one pass. I zipped the bag. She stood there with one hand still resting on the fabric. "You always come back," she said. "Always." She repeated the word, softer this time. "Always." When she left that night, she lingered on my porch like she was trying to walk away without leaving something behind. I watched from inside longer than I had any reason to. The next morning, while I was checking in at the dock, a text from her came through. "Come back tired, salty, annoying. Just come back." I sent back the only answer that felt natural. Always. At the time, it felt reassuring. Later, it felt like a promise neither of us understood the price of. For 2 months, everything stayed routine, until one storm turned my silence at sea into terror on shore. Life offshore has a way of swallowing individuality. After enough weeks, every day starts to resemble the one before it. Wake, work, eat, watch rotation, fix what broke, check weather, catch a few hours of sleep. Do it all again. Salt settled into your skin. Steel became your landscape. The hum of the vessel climbed through your boots so often that eventually you stopped noticing it unless it went away. The first 2 months passed that way. I sent Karen 3 short emails in that stretch. Nothing dramatic. Weather updates, bad food jokes, one message complaining about a cook who seemed personally committed to overcooking every egg on board. She answered all of them. Sometimes she wrote a paragraph. Sometimes she wrote 2 lines. But every reply carried some small piece of home. Your mail is piling up. Your mower still hates you. My Friday client brought me coffee again. It rained, and yes, I was right before you ask. Those little messages did more than entertain me. They reminded me that somewhere beyond all that water, time was still happening in human-sized pieces. Then the company pushed us farther out. We crossed beyond reliable satellite coverage, and communication got worse by the week. Some days email worked, some days it didn't. Some stretches disappeared entirely. At night, on the quieter watches, I found myself thinking about Karen in ways I hadn't fully admitted before. Not in some dramatic fantasy, more in the way a man notices the same thought returning every day and starts realizing it may not be casual anymore. I thought about her porch light. I thought about Sunday bread. I thought about the way she squinted at the sky before announcing with absolute confidence that it was about to rain. The farther out we went, the more those land-based details mattered, which is probably why, when the storm hit, home wasn't an abstract place in my mind anymore. It had a face. On day 143, the forecast failed, the radio died, and Karen received the kind of phone call no one ever forgets. The weather had not looked serious when the shift began. That's the thing about offshore work: danger rarely announces itself with enough courtesy to let everyone prepare emotionally. By late afternoon, the wind had changed. By dusk, waves were hitting wrong. By full dark, what should have been a hard run had turned into 6 hours of white-knuckle work just to keep the vessel stable and the load secure. Water broke over the bow. Metal complained. Commands came sharper. Deck noise changed from routine to urgent. Every man on board shifted out of habit and into trained focus. No one had time for panic. Offshore, panic gets replaced by procedure if you're lucky enough to have been drilled properly. Then radio contact dropped. Once. Returned in static. Dropped again. After that, nothing. The vessel missed scheduled check-ins. On our end, all that meant was one more problem layered on top of weather, timing, and keeping everyone upright. On shore, it meant protocol. And protocol meant calling the emergency contact on file. Karen was that contact. Not because of a paperwork trick. Not because family was unavailable in theory. Because in practice, by then, she was the person I trusted most to answer if the world went sideways. My brother lived in another state. My mother was gone. My father and I had been distant for years. When I updated those forms months earlier, putting Karen first had felt obvious. I just hadn't thought about what obvious would feel like from her side if the phone ever actually rang. That night, while I was on deck trying to think only about the next task in front of me, Karen was in her kitchen hearing phrases like loss of contact, standard procedure, and it may be up to 18 hours before we know more. I was fighting weather. She was fighting imagination. And what imagination did to her that night would eventually become the reason she ran barefoot across the yard the moment I came home. Karen told me later that the call came a little after 9 at night. The woman from the company sounded professional, which is probably the worst possible tone for news like that. Not cruel, not kind, just careful. The kind of voice used by people who have procedures to follow and too little information to give. Karen asked if the boat had sunk. The answer she got was worse than yes and worse than no. We cannot confirm that, ma'am. That single sentence trapped her in the most brutal place possible, between disaster and hope. She opened a marine tracking app and stared at the frozen last known position of our vessel. Every few minutes she refreshed it. Nothing changed. The dot stayed still. The timestamp got older. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock, then 2. The room around her never changed, but everything inside her did. She tried coffee and abandoned it half-finished. She walked to the window and back. She reread one of my old emails. She pulled up a photo I'd sent months earlier wearing an orange life vest, joking that I looked like the Gulf's least convincing fashion icon. That was when she started crying. Around 4 in the morning, she called her sister. Not because her sister could fix anything, but because there are certain hours of fear that a person should not have to sit through alone. Her sister stayed awake with her until sunrise, talking her through possibilities, repeating the same fragile logic people use when no better comfort exists. No news isn't always bad news. Signals fail. Weather passes. Boats reappear. All true. None of it was enough to stop the images her mind kept building. By dawn, Karen wasn't just afraid of losing me. She was finally admitting what losing me would actually mean. When the tracker finally blinked back to life, relief hit her hard butt. It also stripped away the last lie she had been telling herself about how she felt. Near sunrise, the tracker moved. Not dramatically, not with any cinematic flourish, just a small shift on a screen that told her the vessel was alive, moving, and no longer missing. Relief doesn't always look like joy. Sometimes it looks like the body giving up all at once after holding itself together for too long. Karen said she had to sit down on the kitchen floor because her legs suddenly felt borrowed. Her shoulders dropped. Her lungs finally worked again. She cried harder after the danger passed than she had while it was still unknown. That was also the moment she stopped lying to herself. She did not merely care about me. She did not merely appreciate me. She was not simply attached to a neighbor whose porch she happened to cross too often. She loved me. Maybe she had for a while. Maybe the feeling had been forming slowly over months of bread, gutters, borrowed tools, and quiet routines. But that night burned away every excuse she had made for staying silent. If a woman can spend an entire night imagining the ocean swallowing a man and feel like the world is ending, she no longer gets to call that friendship. The strange part is that none of this reached me at the time. For me, that storm became one more rough story from a long contract. A dangerous night. A dead radio. A lesson in bad forecasting. Then work resumed. The vessel stabilized. The hitch continued. Months passed. I kept moving through routine, unaware that something had changed forever back on shore. By month 5, I was thinking about Karen more than I had any business pretending was casual. The company offered an early release to anyone willing to rotate differently on the next hitch. I accepted immediately. I did not tell her. I wanted to surprise her. It sounded romantic in my head. I had no idea surprise was about to collide with 6 months of fear she had never told me about. The drive home felt ordinary until I turned onto our street and realized Karen's porch light was already on. The drive from the dock took close to 6 hours. That kind of road time does something to a man after months at sea. The truck becomes too quiet. Land feels too still. Your mind starts replaying memories without asking permission. I spend most of that drive thinking about small things. The kind people overlook until distance teaches them what actually matters. The smell of Karen's kitchen when she baked bread. The way she'd hold a mug in both hands when she was tired. Her habit of predicting rain with total confidence even when the sky disagreed. How often I had started measuring home not by my own front door, but by whether hers had a light on. The closer I got, the more one truth settled in. Somewhere along the line, she had stopped being part of my neighborhood and started being part of my sense of return. I didn't call, didn't text, didn't give anyone a heads up. I wanted the moment raw and unscripted. In my mind, I had built a harmless little scene. She'd hear the truck. She'd look up, maybe laugh, maybe accuse me of trying to kill her with a surprise, maybe hug me and tell me I looked terrible. That was the version I expected. By the time I turned onto our street, the sun was low and throwing long shadows across both yards. Her car sat in the driveway. Her porch light was already on, even though night hadn't fully arrived. I noticed it and thought nothing of it. Then I eased into my own driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a second with my hands still on the wheel, letting the quiet settle over me the way it always does after a long hitch. The front door across the yard flew open. Not slowly, not curiously, urgently. And when Karen started running, I understood immediately that this was not a normal welcome home. I stepped out expecting laughter and a hug, but what I got instead felt like someone grabbing proof that a ghost had turned solid. Karen reached me before I had both boots on the ground. She didn't wave. She didn't smile first. She grabbed my jacket with both hands and held on like fabric was the only thing standing between her and another night she never wanted to relive. Her breathing was broken and fast. Her eyes were already wet. Grass clung to her bare feet and lower legs. "You're early," she said, breathless. "No one told me you were coming early." "I didn't tell anyone," I said. "Karen, what's wrong?" She pulled back only enough to look at my face as if she needed to confirm every detail of it. That expression is hard to describe. Relief was in it. So was anger. So was disbelief. So was the leftover edge of old fear that had never fully left her body. "The company called me in March," she said. I stared at her. "What?" Her grip tightened again. "They told me contact was lost with your vessel. They said it might be 18 hours before they knew anything." For a second, everything inside me dropped. "I didn't know they ever made that call. I sat at my kitchen table all night," she said. "I didn't know if you were alive." The air between us changed after that sentence. The whole street felt still enough to hear. Her porch light burned behind her. My duffel still hung from my shoulder. My truck door was half open. Ordinary things remained in place, but the moment had already gone somewhere else. "I didn't know," I said again, weaker this time. "Karen, I had no idea." She swallowed hard and looked away, then back at me. There was more behind her eyes than the storm, more than fear. A sentence she was deciding whether or not she could survive saying. Slowly I asked, "What else?" She took one breath, then another, then finally told me the thing she had been carrying for more than a year. What she said next didn't just explain her tears, it split both our lives into before and after. "I'm in love with you." She didn't shout it, didn't whisper it either. It came out clear, exhausted, and real, the kind of truth that arrives after months of restraint and one night too terrifying to let the silence survive. "For over a year," she added. "Maybe longer. I don't know exactly when it changed. I just know that night made me realize I might lose the chance to ever say it." My duffel slid from my shoulder into the wet grass. Shock came first, but not the kind that rejects reality. It was the kind that happens when a truth lands on top of something you have half known for a long time and suddenly realize you were never confused, only afraid. I looked at her barefoot in my yard, crying over a call I never even knew had happened, and everything that had felt nameless for 2 years shifted into focus. "I'm sorry you went through that alone," I said. Karen shook her head. "You don't need to apologize. You were out there doing your job. I just kept thinking, if something had happened to you, I would have lost you without ever telling you." That hit harder than the confession itself. The ocean had nearly taken something from me I hadn't even admitted was mine to lose. I bent and set the duffel fully down, freeing both hands like I needed the rest of my body to catch up with what my heart already understood. "I thought about you every day out there," I said. "More than I ever admitted. More than I should have, maybe, if this was supposed to be simple." A small shift came over her face. Not ease exactly. "Hope. I wondered," she said. "Sometimes I thought maybe I was imagining things." "No," I said. "I think we were both just refusing to say them." The yard went quiet again. But this time the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, unstable, waiting. Confession was one thing. The life that confession demanded was something else entirely. Because once love was out in the open, we had to answer a harder question. What happens when the sea still expects to take me away? We did not go inside right away. Instead, we sat down on my porch steps as if some part of both of us knew that a conversation like this needed to happen in the open air, where nothing felt trapped. My truck door was still hanging open behind us. The duffel sat abandoned in the grass between the yards. Neither of us cared. Karen told me the whole story. The late-night call, the tracker app, the frozen position, the coffee she couldn't finish, the 4 a.m. phone call to her sister, the sunrise update that dropped her to the kitchen floor in relief. I listened without interrupting much. Offshore, you learn to hear rough stories, but this one was different because I'd been alive inside it without knowing it existed. "Why didn't you tell me after?" I asked. She looked out toward the yard rather than at me. Because if I told you that, I'd have to tell you the rest of it too. The part where you love me. The part where every time you left, I hated how little right I had to say I didn't want you to go. That sentence stayed with me. I asked her then what I had been afraid to ask, even before she said any of this. Did you think I'd feel trapped? Karen gave a tired, watery laugh. Honestly? Yes. You had this whole ocean life. This identity built around leaving. I didn't want to become the thing that made you feel tied down. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and told her the truth I should have said long before that night. I only feel trapped where I'm not understood. I never felt that with you. She turned and looked at me in a way that made 2 years of almost suddenly feel visible. Then maybe we were both being idiots, she said. That sounds about right. But honesty has momentum, and once we started, the conversation stopped being about feelings alone. By the end of that night, we weren't just talking about love, we were talking about whether my life at sea could keep existing in the same shape at all. Karen asked the question gently, which somehow made it hit harder. What happens the next time you leave? Not if. Not would you ever. Just what happens. That was real life entering the room. A confession is easy compared to logistics. Anyone can say I love you under the right pressure. Building a life around it takes less drama and more honesty. I admitted something then that I had barely admitted to myself. The company had been offering me shorter rotations for a while. There's a Gulf Coast route, I said. Shorter hitches, less money. She absorbed that quietly. And you never took it? No. Why not? Because the pay was better farther out, and because I stopped, then finished properly. Because until now, I didn't think there was anything on shore important enough to change my whole structure for. The porch went still after that. Karen didn't smile right away. She didn't rush toward a neat romantic answer. She asked the only thing that mattered. And now? Now I can't pretend this doesn't matter. Her shoulders lowered in a way that looked almost like relief. I'm not asking you to give up your life overnight, she said. I just need to know that if we do this, the ocean doesn't get to decide everything for us. That sentence landed with uncomfortable precision. For years, I had let contracts, money, distance, and habit shape my life because it was easier than stopping to ask whether they still deserved that kind of authority. I reached for her hand. I don't have every answer tonight, I said, but I know I don't want to keep living like this part of my life is optional. That was enough for that night. Not certainty, not a grand vow. Just the first honest alignment between us. And intention, once spoken aloud, has a way of forcing change. Over the next few weeks, small things shifted first, and those small shifts led straight to a decision that would alter the rhythm of both our lives. After that night, things did not become louder. Oddly enough, they became calmer. Karen started leaving her porch light on every evening, whether I was expected or not. When I asked about it, she shrugged and said, I like knowing the way is visible. It was such a simple sentence, but I knew what she meant. The light wasn't about electricity. It was about presence. I started asking the company serious questions about a transfer. No vague curiosity this time. Real numbers. Real schedules. Real consequences. We still moved carefully. 2 years of almost saying something had taught us that rushing emotional change can make even true things feel unstable. So instead of forcing labels, we built patterns. Dinner together. Coffee on the porch. Shared grocery runs. Messages that no longer pretended to be casual. She would come home from a long day at the clinic and find pasta waiting at my place. I would step out to take the trash down and end up on her porch for 2 hours. The line between our two houses didn't vanish all at once. It faded under repetition. One night over coffee, she asked, if they approved the shorter rotation, will you really take it? Yes. She looked almost suspicious. That fast? It isn't fast, I said. I think I'm just late. That finally made her smile. The transfer went through in December. 6 months away became 2 weeks on, 2 weeks home. The pay cut was real, significant enough to notice. But when I told Karen, The look on her face made every financial calculation feel smaller than I had once believed possible. For years, I had treated money like proof that the sacrifice made sense. Standing there with her, I understood that there are sacrifices which stop making sense the moment you finally have something worth returning to. I thought that decision would solve everything. What it actually did was begin the healing, because shorter trips reduced the distance, but they did not erase the fear that had already carved itself into Karen's body. The new schedule was harder emotionally than I expected, at least at first. My body still packed for absence like it was preparing for exile. I'd throw a bag together for a 2-week hitch and feel myself slipping into the same old ritual-guarded, braced, already detached before I had even left the driveway. Karen noticed before I did. "You keep saying goodbye like you're leaving for 6 months," she said one morning while driving me to the dock. Dawn was still soft outside. Her hand stayed on the wheel. "How am I saying goodbye?" I asked. "Like it's an ending instead of a routine." She was right. For over a decade, departure had meant emotional shutdown. That reflex didn't disappear just because the calendar changed. Every goodbye still carried the ghost of longer absences. And every time I braced that way, I could see something old and frightened wake up in her too. So we changed the ritual. No more dramatic promises. No more loaded silence. No more acting like every departure might be final. Instead, we replaced intensity with consistency. Text me at the first check-in. Call when you get range. I'll leave the porch light on. I'll be here when you get back. That was the new language. Winter passed. We got steadier. Then, in February, the company called with an emergency hitch. A crew member had broken his leg during a transfer. They needed a replacement fast. 4 days only. Short run. Nothing like the old contracts. Karen said yes before I even asked the question. But during the drive to the dock, she said quietly, "Part of me still goes back to that March night." I looked over at her. "I'll call every time there's signal." "I know," she said. "I'm just trying to teach my body that silence doesn't automatically mean disaster." That may have been the most honest sentence either of us had spoken in months. The trip was supposed to be small. Instead, it became our first real test. When weather knocked out signal on day 3, the real question wasn't whether Karen would be afraid. It was whether fear would own her the way it had before. The first 2 days went smoothly. Calm enough water. Routine work. Contact whenever we moved through signal range. I called Karen each time, even if it was only long enough to say the words "I'm fine" and hear her answer with "good." That's all I needed. Those short calls did more than reassure her. They build evidence, the kind fear hates. Then day 3 turned rough. Not catastrophic, not the kind of storm that rewrites lives. But weather doesn't have to be historic to stir old damage. Wind picked up. The deck got meaner. Satellite signal dropped for almost 6 hours. By the time service returned, my phone lit up with missed calls and one text. "I know you're probably fine. I just needed to hear your voice once you're back in range." "I'm okay. Just checking." I called immediately. She answered on the first ring. "Hey," I said. "I'm fine. Weather got ugly. Signal dropped, that's all." There was a breath on the line, long, shaky, but controlled. "I waited," she said. That was such a small sentence, but I knew what it meant. She had not spent the whole night at the kitchen table. She had not called her sister in panic. She had not let imagination consume the entire room. "You didn't spiral?" "A little," she admitted, then gave a small laugh. "But not all the way. I got worried. I hated it. But I waited." I stood by the rail with cold spray hitting my face and felt something shift in me too. Not relief. Not exactly. Respect. For the work she had done inside herself. For the fact that healing doesn't usually arrive as a dramatic victory. Sometimes it arrives as a person managing to sit still for 6 difficult hours and not surrender to the worst story their mind knows how to tell. "That's progress," I said. "No," she answered. "That's trust." And when I came home after that trip, I realized trust had changed the shape of homecoming too. Because this time Karen didn't run barefoot across the yard, and somehow that calm welcome told me even more than the first one had. When I pulled into the driveway 4 days later, Karen was already on the porch. She was holding a mug, sitting with one leg folded beneath her, looking at me the way people look at something they are no longer afraid will disappear if they blink. Relief was there, but it no longer controlled the whole scene. "No dramatic sprint this time?" I asked as I climbed out. She smiled. "I'm saving the Barefoot emergency run for actual emergencies." I laughed and walked toward her, and for the first time I understood just how beautiful an uneventful homecoming can be. No tears, no shaking hands, no old fear running ahead of us. Just a porch, a mug of coffee, and the knowledge that ordinary had finally become something we could trust. "Boring is underrated," she said when I sat beside her. "It really is. Boring means nothing went wrong." That line stayed with me. For years, I had lived a life that confused intensity with meaning. Danger felt important because it was dramatic. Distance felt noble because it was expensive. But sitting there beside her, I began to understand that peace has a kind of depth adrenaline can never touch. After that, our two houses became separate, mostly on paper. My truck sat in her driveway as often as mine. Her coffee maker became ours. My kitchen lost half its dishes to her cabinets. Her clinic paperwork migrated onto my table. We did not officially move in together right away because we had learned the hard way that crisis can make people sprint toward decisions they haven't actually built the ground for. Instead, we drifted deliberately. Until one evening, standing in the middle of overlapping jackets, books, tools, and grocery bags, Karen looked around and said, "We should probably admit this isn't two households anymore." She said it lightly, but the decision underneath it was anything but small. Moving in together wasn't just about addresses. It was the moment we had to decide whether we were finally ready to turn survival into a chosen future. We chose her house. It was the practical choice. Her converted garage worked perfectly for her physical therapy practice, while mine offered nothing comparable. I sold my place, paid off the truck, and put the rest into savings for whatever came next. The moving day itself was almost disappointingly normal. No cinematic confession. No storm. No emergency call. Just boxes, tape, a rented truck, and two people carrying years of separate routines into one shared space. "Does it feel different?" Karen asked after we set down the last box. "How?" "Choosing this. On purpose. Not just surviving our way into it." I looked around the room. The furniture, the scattered blankets, the same porch visible through the window. The woman who had once run barefoot through wet grass because she thought she might have lost me before she ever told me the truth. "Yes," I said. "It feels sturdier." That summer I moved to an even shorter schedule, 1 week on, 1 week home. Family rotation. Karen told me I didn't have to change again. I told her I wanted to. I'm glad I did. The following winter, her mother got sick. Hospital visits stretched 3 hours each way. There were tests, waiting rooms, cafeteria coffee, insurance paperwork, exhausted drives back after dark. If I had still been living my old 6-month life, Karen would have carried that season almost entirely alone. Instead, I was there. To drive. To wait. To sit beside her in silence. To be useful in all the quiet ways that matter more than speeches. One night in a hospital waiting room, she rested her head against my shoulder and said, "If you were still gone for months at a time, I don't know how I would have done this." I didn't give her a polished answer. I just took her hand, because by then, the truth was obvious. Love is not only tested by storms, it is tested by paperwork, bad coffee, fluorescent waiting rooms, grief, exhaustion, and the thousand unremarkable burdens no one writes songs about. Almost 2 years after that first barefoot sprint, we sat together on the porch under the same warm light and watched evening settle over a yard that no longer felt divided at all. Karen smiled and said, "I used to think that storm was the worst thing that ever happened to us. Now I think it might have saved us." I squeezed her hand. "I'm just glad you ran." She laughed. I stepped on a rock halfway across the yard. Worth it? Completely. Some love stories begin with grand gestures. Ours began with a porch light, wet grass, an old fear, and a woman who decided that if I came home alive, she would never stay silent again. If this story moved you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you want more emotional homecoming stories like this one, subscribe because the next one might hit even harder.